Hi, it's Katrina. From a young boy taken in by chimpanzees to girls growing up with wolves, here are 8 stories of people who were raised by animals. Number 9. Leopard Boy. There is a story from 1912 from the town of Assam, south of the Himalayan Mountains, of a boy that got kidnapped by a leopard. A leopardess came out of the dark and stole the boy from his parents. Before they could do anything, the leopardess and the child were gone. 3 years later, a hunter was out in the woods and spotted the child living with the leopard mother and her other cubs. The hunter brought him back to the village somehow, and he acted just like a leopard. He ran on all fours as fast as an adult man, and his toes were upright, almost at right angles to his instep. He had tough skin and calluses all over his body. Makes sense since he was living in the jungle. Anyone that came near him was growled at and attacked. He could not speak, only grunt and growl, and when he could, he would eat raw chicken. Over time, he was able to assimilate back into human society and later even learn to speak. Number 8. Girl raised by monkeys. When a story surfaced about a young Colombian girl who had been raised by monkeys, the general public understandably questioned whether the story was even real. Now an adult living in England, Marina Chapman shared her story of being taken care of by monkeys after a truly terrifying experience. She remembers playing close to her home and noticing 2 adults creeping behind her. Someone covered her mouth with a white handkerchief, and after blacking out, the girl awoke to find herself being driven into the Colombian rainforest where she was later let go. Believing her kidnappers would return for her, Marina hoped to be rescued by anyone, but she was alone in the forest. Screaming and crying with no one coming for her, she started to walk looking for signs of human life. Eventually, Marina says she came across a group of small monkeys who she watched playing and tending to one another like a family. After eating a tamarind and getting food poisoning, Marina believed she was going to die. While lying on the ground writhing in agony, an elderly monkey led her to muddy water where she drank and vomited and then soon began to recover. After that, she said the young monkeys befriended her and took care of her. She would gather bananas that the monkeys would drop from the trees, eventually becoming comfortable enough with the monkeys that they would allow her to sit in the trees with them. She thinks that she probably spent about 5 years with them. Gradually, the young girl began to understand the noises the monkeys made and began to forget her own language. But she would later say that as the press started to share her story, they exaggerated what had happened to her. She insists that she scavenged food from the monkeys, but they didn't provide for her and only invited her into their extended family to a certain extent. But she did say that one of her favorite pastimes was sitting in the trees being groomed by the monkeys. One day she saw hunters in the jungle and pleaded with them to rescue her, which they did in a way. Although it might have been better if she had stayed with the monkeys. Unfortunately, she ended up having to escape from them and lived on the streets with other homeless children and stole to survive, later being adopted by a family when she was around 14 years of age. As she started a new life and later met her future husband, Marina slowly told her family the truth about her time in the jungle. She still planned to return to Colombia to track down her birth family, but for now, the girl with no name still has recurrent dreams of the monkeys and the time they spent together. And now for number 7, but first, be sure to subscribe to Origins Explained before you leave and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on the latest videos. Number 7. Girl raised by dogs. The life of a young girl from Ukraine named Oxana Malaya took a devastating turn after her parents neglected her as a child. When she was 3 years old, Oksana was locked out of the house by her alcoholic parents and crawled to the nearest source of warmth and shelter, a dog kennel. When her parents didn't notice her absence, Oksana stayed in the kennel with the dogs, living there over 5 years. Strangely enough, she did occasionally see other humans and from time to time went back to her parents' house, but most of the time she was outside. Oksana mostly stayed with the dogs and learned to live the way that they did by eating raw meat, walking on all fours, barking, and sleeping in the kennel with them. Sometime later, a member of the public contacted police about Oksana. They investigated and found her with the dogs, who tried to protect her from the officers. By the time she was removed from her parents' house, she had not only forgotten how to walk upright, but doctors worried she might lose the ability to speak properly again. Some researchers say that if a child hasn't been spoken to by the age of 5, they will lose the capacity to learn to talk. Taken to an orphanage school, Oksana was taught how to walk upright again. She also relearned how to talk, how to use her hands, and other basics of living as a human and not a dog. Now almost 40 years old, Oksana lives in a home for the mentally disabled, tending to the farm animals there. Despite her unusual upbringing, Oksana has shown herself to be very intelligent after living such a different life during her formative years. In 2003, she was briefly reunited with her father, but the meeting was strained. And as recently as 2013, she appeared on a Ukrainian television show explaining how her life had developed. She continues to live her life on a farm tending to animals, showing her remarkable development despite the difficult way her life began. Number 6. Boys raised by primates. In 1996, a 2-year-old boy was found in the Falgore forest of northern Nigeria. Believed to have been abandoned by his parents at the age of about 6 months, the young boy named Bello walked like a chimpanzee, using his legs but dragging his arms on the ground. Both physically and mentally disabled, some believe the young boy was abandoned because of these disabilities, a practice that was common within the Fulani tribe of Nigeria. Unable to fend for himself, Bello was adopted by the chimpanzees that live in the forest. At first, there wasn't much coverage of his discovery. It wasn't until 2002 that the news media discovered the young boy was living in a home for displaced children. Reports surfaced that he often disturbed other children in the home by throwing objects and jumping and leaping around at night. Although he never learned to speak despite having human interactions in the home with other children, Bello still continued to display the behaviors of a chimpanzee, and sadly in 2005 he died of undetermined causes. Another boy named John Sebunya from Uganda ran away from home after seeing his father murder his mother. Later cared for by green African monkeys in the jungle, John was eventually found by tribeswomen in 1991 while he was hiding in a tree. She later returned with men from the village, but John resisted capture and his adoptive family of monkeys protected him by throwing sticks at the villagers who were trying to rescue him. When he was found, he was covered in wounds and his knees were scarred from crawling on the ground. After his rescuers were able to identify him, John was brought to a charitable foundation for orphans who took him in and later taught him how to speak again. The subject of a documentary in 1999, John showed off his progression by singing and touring with the Pearl of Africa Children's Choir, giving some hope to the promise of him continuing to live a normal human life. Number 5. Boys raised by goats. The story of a 2-year-old boy from Russia is a heartbreaking one when you learn that his mother is the one responsible for him being raised by goats. The malnourished child named Sasha T was kept in a room with the goats by his mother. He was basically abandoned and did not learn how to speak or eat, and he played and slept with the goats. Being subjected to such conditions, including an ice-cold room with hardly any clothing or human interaction, meant that Sasha's brain did not develop properly. He also weighed 1/3 less than a typical child of his age. At the hospital, the boy refused to sleep in a bed and tried to get underneath and sleep there. He showed that he was very scared of adults and tried to break everything he saw. Sadly, he could not speak or hold a spoon to eat and did not have any idea what to do with toys that were given to him. As authorities took over Sasha's case, they set out to deprive his mother of her maternal rights, making him an orphan. A sad fate for a young boy, but hopefully one that will allow him to recover and be adopted by a new family who would properly take care of him. Number 4. Young girl raised as a pet. Another child in eastern Russia had a similarly difficult upbringing. The 5-year-old girl named Natasha had been so neglected that she did not have human vocabulary and only communicated through making animal noises. Found living with her father, grandparents, and other relatives, Natasha was treated like one of the dogs or cats that the family owned, lapping food from a bowl on the floor. Her mother, who had not had contact with the girl for 2 years, was arrested along with her husband on suspicion of neglect. Her mother, who had 3 other children living at a different address, saw TV coverage of Natasha being taken into care and was later arrested after going to police. She claimed that Natasha's father had kidnapped her, but there was no evidence that she had made any effort to get Natasha back. Her only companions were the dogs and cats of the house. When concerned neighbors contacted welfare officers, they found her malnourished and too small for her age, although she was relatively healthy considering the ordeal she had been through. Number 3. Wolf Girls. In 1920, a reverend at a missionary in northern India heard a story of 2 ghostly spirits that had accompanied a band of wolves nearby in the Bengal jungle. Local villagers were afraid of the apparitions, even going so far as adopting a local custom of not doing any harm to the wolves. The reverend sat in a treetop overlooking the wolf's lair and waited until they came out one by one. When they did, he noticed 2 figures, hunched to the ground, who came out into the clearing with very human bodies. hunched on all fours. It turned out that the two figures were young girls, one 8 years old and the other around 2, who had spent so long walking on all fours that their joints had shortened and they were unable to walk upright. They growled and twitched in their sleep and only came out after the moon rose, howling to be set free. Named Kamala and Amala, the girls were taken in by the Reverend, who did his best to bring out their human characteristics. Sadly, though, the younger girl, Amala, got sick and died. After this, Kamala went into a prolonged mourning, but she eventually recovered, learning how to take food, to stand upright, to signal yes and no by moving her head, and to even walk and eventually speak. As Kamala continued to progress, she was able to speak clearly and distinctly. In 1928, she was invited to visit the Psychological Society of New York, but unfortunately she grew weak and died unexpectedly in 1929. No one seems to know exactly how the two girls ended up with the wolves, but it is nice to know that they were eventually rescued and given a better life, even if it was only for a short time. Number 2. Dog Save Young Boy. At the age of 4, a Russian boy named Ivan left his abusive home and ended up befriending a pack of wild dogs by stealing food for them. Treating him like one of the pack, the dogs protected Ivan, allowing him to not only live in their den, but to also learn many of their canine characteristics. Every morning, he and his dogs would go to a local bakery in a town near Moscow and beg for food. When the dogs scavenged for food, they would share it with him too. When police found the boy living with the dogs, they attempted to get him away from them, but the dogs wouldn't allow anyone to go near him. It took 3 attempts to get him away from them, after which he was put into an orphanage. Apparently, the dogs were able to find Ivan at the facility, even waiting for him to come out at the building's gates, but they were unfortunately later put down. Ivan, though, was taken in by a foster mother who cared for him, eventually seeing him get into a cadet school. Now almost 30 years old, Ivan says the only way he survived life on the streets was because he had the dogs to protect and love him. Number 1. Boy raised by chickens. For 22 years, a young boy named Sujit lived a terrible life. Born in rural Fiji, Sujit's mother and father had died when he was young. Completely neglected, Sujit was put out with the chickens by his grandfather before he was 2, and he stayed there for almost 6 years, learning their behavior like pecking at his food and crouching down like he was roosting. When neighbors reported seeing him, he didn't receive the care one would hope he would, and instead was put into an old person's home where he was tied to a bed for 22 years. Isn't that awful? When an Australian businesswoman named Elizabeth Clayton was visiting Fiji, she met Sujit while visiting the home to give donations. Then 31, Sujit was covered in sores and he tried to bite Elizabeth, but she decided to take Sujit in and get him the care he needed. Believing Sujit missed critical windows of opportunity for learning and development, she later found a clinical neuropsychologist who wanted to work with Sujit to help him develop. Sujit already responds to words or cues, but the hope is that with in-depth study as to how Sujit's brain works, doctors can unlock it and help him to not only better understand language, but to hopefully one day speak. Thanks for watching! I'm sorry to say that living with animals is not as romantic as it might sound. What did you think of these stories? Let me know in the comments below and be sure to subscribe before you leave. See you later. Bye!